Good evening, everybody. This is Rabbi Moshe Meir Weiss, inviting you once again to join me for a half an hour of Torah study, the Ezra Hashem Yisbarach. Tonight, I will share with you, Be'ezra Hashem Yisbarach, some afterthoughts about the Megillah Esther. Before I begin, I'd like to once again remind you that if you would like to receive any of our tapes on Purim, or all of them, or you would like to receive any other tapes, such as child raising, why we light the candles Erev Shabbos, Malava Malka, understanding the third Suda on Shabbos, understanding Tefillin, appreciating an Amen, Tefillah, or any other topic, you could call me right now or after the shir or any time in between at 718-983-7095. Once again, to receive tapes, that number is 983-7095. You know, a casual reader of the Megillah, no matter how many Purims he's passed through already, might get a certain impression, and in reality it's a mistaken impression, about the character we know as Achashverosh. A person who reads the Megillah might think that Achashverosh was a person who was hoodwinked successfully by the professional con man Haman, with all kinds of stories about our people. But then Esther came along and straightened out Achashverosh, and Achashverosh reacted with alacrity, and right away punished all the wrongdoers, all the bad guys, putting to death Haman, his sons, and all the Amalekis. So at the end it comes out that we would place Achashverosh on the side of the good guys, and that Achashverosh was a pretty straight fellow who was tricked by Haman. After all, the Medrash tells us that Haman spun a whole web of intrigue around the Jews. He went to Achashverosh and said to Achashverosh, "Listen here, O king, if a fly falls into their wine, they'll take out the fly and drink the wine. After all, Baltashtis. But if the king, his mighty royal majesty, would stick his finger into their wine, then the Jews would spill out the wine." That's how much they hate the king. Now, if we would have had a lawyer over there, we would have said, well, that's only by wine, not by gefilte fish. If the king touches the gefilte fish, we wouldn't throw it away. So obviously, you see, it's not the contaminating powers of the king. It's some special law, some special amendment of our Torah, and it has nothing to do with the king. But Haman really laid it on thick, and we might say he sold a bill of goods to Achashverosh, and therefore Achashverosh was an Inus. He reacted only according to what he thought was the truth. But then Esther came along and straightened him out, and he corrected himself. So we might say, at the end of the Megillah, Achashverosh turned out not to be such a bad guy. Well, this is all a mistake. And whoever thinks this way is not well enough informed of the Midrashim. Because if the Megillah gives us such a mistaken notion, it's only because of the fact that we have to remember that the Megillah had to be written right under Achashverosh's nose. And he had his censor examine very carefully the Megillah. And therefore when Mordechai and Esther prepared the Megillah, Beruach Kocham, with their divine spirit, they had to do it craftily and shrewdly, that it should be able to convey to us the true character of Achashverosh. And even though that might not be so praiseworthy, that might not be so pleasing, it had to be passed and accepted by Achashverosh and his senses. And therefore, if we want to know the true character of Achashverosh, a true portfolio on his character and his identity, we have to dig a little bit deeper. And right away in the beginning of the Megillah, if we look in the Gemara right away dispels any ideas we might have of Achashverosh's character. Because the Gemara says, "Vayihi bimei Achashverosh hu Achashverosh." The Gemara says whenever it says "hu" like that before the name, it means "hu Achashverosh b'rish'asai mitchilasai vad saifai." He is the same Achashverosh in his wickedness from beginning to end. Which means that just like in the beginning of the Megillah, we saw clearly that this was a king who wanted to commit murder against the Jews, he never reformed. He never repented. hu Achashverosh mitchilasei v'ad soifei. And likewise, we know that the Gemara tells us why was he called Achashverosh? It was a corruption of two words, Ochiv Shel Rosh. He was the brother of one who was known as Rosh. Who was that referring to? None other than the wicked Nebuchadnezzar, who set siege to Yerushalayim, who destroyed our temple, and who exiled us into Babel. So we're saying that Achashverosh was a worthy brother of Nebuchadnezzar. Just like Nebuchadnezzar was a destroyer, just like Nebuchadnezzar was a murderer, so that was the character we know as Achashverosh. And indeed, even though we yell, Orur Haman, and we bang during the Megillah by Haman, the only reason why we don't bang by Achashverosh is because Haman is an Amaleki, and we have a special mitzvah of Mechias Amalek. However, Achashverosh, the Medrash tells us, was even worse than Haman. Now that might come as a shock to you. We always paint on Purim Haman as the worst villain. But in reality, there are two midrashim in Esther Rabbah that tell us that's not so. Indeed, Achashverosh was worse than Haman. Why? One medrash tells us that when, at that crucial feast that Esther invited Achashverosh and Haman to, it says that Achashverosh, when Esther made her moving plea, save my life as my request and my people as my favor from you, so Achashverosh looked in shock and bewilderment at Esther, and he said, in a true perplexity, who is the villain? Who is the crook? Who is the perpetrator of such a dastardly deed that he wants to kill my queen and her people? Who is this terrible, terrible oppressor? And the Medrash tells us that Esther instinctively went to point towards Achashverosh. In other words, between the two, Achashverosh and Haman, Esther genuinely felt that Achashverosh was the worst. Because after all, Haman, he was only a subject. He couldn't kill the Jews on his own. He had to have the royal signet ring of the king himself. So it was the king's decision, and it was in the king's power. And the king was the one that gave the command. So the king was worse. And Esther was going to point at Achashverosh. But Providence sent an angel to push her to Haman, because in the plan of things, it would have been bad for the Jews if Esther would have pointed at Achashverosh. But we see that Esther's decision, and who was on top of the situation more than Esther, is that Achashverosh was worse. And yet there's another medrash. The medrash tells us that when Haman went to Achashverosh and offered money to pay for the Jews in order that he should be able to massacre them freely, Achashverosh wouldn't take the money. Instead, he handed over his signet ring to Haman. And the Gemara says, look how Achashverosh hated the Jews more than Haman. Normally, the seller, the one who sells the item, takes a pledge. He takes a pledge. Over here, the seller, Achashverosh, is giving a pledge. He's giving a pledge to Haman. He's giving a pledge. He's giving a signet ring to Haman. So the Medrash points out how we see that Achashverosh hated the Jews even more than Haman. Now, you have to realize that we don't get this impression simply because we have to remember once again that when the Megillah was written, it was written to be pleasing to Achashverosh. Otherwise, it would have never been accepted by the Persian Empire, whose ruler was Achashverosh. And therefore, that's why, if you look in the Megillah, you'll find that many things aren't mentioned. For example, you don't find in the entire Megillah that Vashti was killed. The Megillah only makes a coy reference about that. The Megillah just says that Vashti will not appear anymore before Achashverosh. And that's it. It doesn't say that she was killed, because it would be embarrassing for Achashverosh to have it mentioned that he killed his bride, Vashti, by the advice of Haman, who he later killed as a traitor. And even the fact that he killed her because she refused his absurd, outrageous, obscene request was embarrassing to him. And therefore, he had it written only in the Megillah that she shouldn't come before him anymore. And that's it. That she just shouldn't come before the king. And like it says, and I'll quote, Well, Asher lo yisavoi Vashti lifnei HaMelech Achashverosh. Vashti won't come anymore before the king. It doesn't say clearly. We know the Medrash says she was burnt at the stake. But the Megillah didn't say that outright because it would have been embarrassing to Achashverosh. Likewise, that's why when it says that there was an advisor that gave advice to Achashverosh, it calls him by the name of Memuchen. Now we know that that was Haman. So why doesn't it say Haman? We recognize Haman better than Memuchen. Now we know that Haman was called Memuchen because he was Memuchen lePeronios, because he was ready to be punished. He was ready, he was all set to get retribution, which fell on top of his head. And also because Memuchen stands for Mumkan. There's a blemish over here. Everything that he did was flawed. Everything that he did was selfish and for the wrong motivation. But the reason why he was called by his alias was, again, not to embarrass the king, because it would be embarrassing if it's clear that he listened to the advice of Haman to kill his wife, afterwards killing Haman, that very self-same man, because he was a traitor. And therefore he was disguised as a different person, as Memuchen. Now, other places in the Megillah, we also see that things were left out. For example, we know that when Achashverosh made his beauty contest and sent out for all contestants, so we know that Mordechai hid Esther and only took her out of hiding when he saw that it was impossible to hide her any further. But it doesn't say that in the Megillah, because even at the end, Mordechai didn't want Achashverosh to know that he hid Esther. And therefore it says just Vatilokach Esther al Beis HaMelech v'yad Haggai Shem HaNoshim. It doesn't say anything that she was hidden from before. Likewise, we know that Esther was married to Mordechai, and even after she was living with Achashverosh, still she was going after Achashverosh. She went to the mikveh, and then she went back to Mordechai. But it doesn't say anywhere in the Megillah that she was Mordechai's wife, because that would be very wrong for the queen to live with a man like Mordechai. And therefore it just tells us Asher lokach loy levas, that Mordechai took her as a daughter. We know with our code that al tikrei levas ela levayis. Don't read it bas, a daughter, but rather for a house. And that means that Esther was Mordechai's house. She took care of his house. She was the akeres habayis. But again, it had to be in code because that wouldn't be acceptable to Achashverosh, so it had to be hidden from him. That's why one has to study the Megillah in great depth to really see in between the letters and see the information that Mordechai and Esther hid from Achashverosh's eyes. Now, working on these wavelengths, it is a little difficult to understand how Mordechai and Esther were able to get away with the plan of what it says in the Megillah, that Ein Esther Magedes es Amo ve'es Meiladata. Esther did not reveal her nationality nor her birthplace. For that was what Mordechai commanded her to do. Now this is a little bit strange. Achashverosh should have got mad at that. You have to remember that Achashverosh desperately was trying to find out his queen's identity. And he went to all great lengths to find out. He wanted to know who his queen was. And she refused to tell him. Now, we explained once that it was possible that she was able to get away with it. I mean, how was she able to get away with it? Achashverosh could have stormed in and said, I force you to tell me. And what was she going to do then? But we could understand it with the information that the Megillah gives us, that Ein of the Ein. She didn't have a father nor a mother. And we know that that means, the Medrash tells us, that when she was conceived, her father died, and when she was born, her mother died. And therefore, it was obvious that she could pass off her not knowing her ancestry by giving the plausible excuse, Achashverosh, I don't know. I'm a foundling. I never knew my father. I never knew my mother. I don't know who I'm descended from. I know that somebody brought me up, but I don't know who I really am. And Achashverosh had to buy that. But once it was revealed in the Megillah, and it says it clearly in the Megillah that she didn't reveal Amov and Moladata, ki Mordechai tziva aleh asher lo yisagid, because Mordechai commanded her not to tell the king. So now, in retrospect, shouldn't the king get angry at that? How did the king allow that? Shouldn't he have been angry at Mordechai? Why didn't you allow my own wife to tell her ancestry? And after all, the king could have really been upset at Mordechai by saying, hey, listen, Mordechai, if I would have known that my king was a Jewess, I would have never acceded to Haman's plot at all. So Mordechai, you were really in the wrong. You really put the Jews in danger. How come the Mordechai and Esther were able to get away and decided to put that in the Megillah that Mordechai was the one that told Esther not to say anything? Mordechai should have rather deleted that from the Megillah. Let Achashverosh think the way he thought all the time, that the reason why Esther didn't reveal her nationality is because she didn't know who she was. By doing that, you wouldn't have had to deal with Achashverosh's wrath later on. Listen, Mordechai, you're the one that started all the problems. If you would have let Esther reveal that she was a Jewess, I would have never agreed to Haman in the beginning. Could be the answer to this question is that Mordechai told Achashverosh a different explanation. If you look, after it says in the Megillah that Ein Esther Mageres es Ama ves Meladata Kasher Tziva Lea Mordechai, right after that is the incident with Bigsan Vaseresh. That Mordechai uncovered the plot of Bigsan Vaseresh to murder the king. Now it's very possible that these two episodes were put in close juxtaposition for a specific reason. And that is, Mordechai will later on explain to Achashverosh, listen, Almighty King, the reason why I concealed my connection to Esther, and I told Esther not to reveal her identity, is because I wanted to remain incognito. I wanted to remain an unknown bystander. If people would have found out that Esther is Jewish, they would have traced my connection to her, and people would have stayed away from me. And I wouldn't have been able to be a spy for the king's good. You see what happened? Because I was able to remain incognito, I was able to be within earshot of Bigsan and Seresh, and I was able to save His Majesty's life. But if they would have known that I'm the Queen's uncle, forget about it. They wouldn't have spoke within a mile of me. You would be very dead now. And therefore Achashverosh accepted that explanation, and that's why Mordechai and Esther were able to get away with putting in the Megillah the fact that the reason why Esther didn't reveal her identity was because Mordechai told her. Now you see, this could get very complicated, like I'm showing you, how you have to understand how certain things Mordechai deleted because he didn't want Achashverosh to be upset about, and why certain things were able to get into the Megillah, and to understand how Mordechai was able to pass off this information. But now I'm going to show you certain things that were openly stated in the Megillah that shows and portrays to us a character picture of Achashverosh. Before I do, I want to once again remind our listeners that if you would want to receive tonight's tape or any other tape, you could call me right now at 718-983-7095. That's 718-983-7095. You could call me now or after the shir. Now, to give you an example of what we see in the Megillah concerning Achashverosh's true colors, you have to realize that the Megillah says clearly that Achashverosh had agreed to give his permission to Haman to kill out the entire Jewish nation. Lahashmid, la'roig, ula'abed, to totally annihilate, to kill, and to cause to perish Kol HaYehudim. And then there goes into a description. Mina'ar va'adzoking. Achashverosh gave them permission, gave Haman and his troops permission to go into the hospitals and strangle the babies in the incubators, and to go into the nursing homes and rip out the IVs and life support systems for all the Zakanim. Taf v'noshim, all the most vulnerable Jewish people, the women, the babies, the infants. Achashverosh readily consented to killing all of them. And Achashverosh wasn't embarrassed to have this recorded. So we're talking about an unabashed mass murder. He was willing to massacre the entire Jewish nation. What stopped him from doing it? Only his insane love for Esther. Because that's what happened. He tells Esther, well, if I would have known that they were your people, I would have never dreamed of doing it. And he killed the one who plotted against his queen. But it's only what changed his mind, not the wrongness of his doing. No, like we said, he was frustrated that he couldn't kill the Jews. But because Hashem endowed in him this providentially insane love for Esther, he was hamstrung. He couldn't do anything because he loved her so much that he couldn't think of killing anybody related to her. So he had to cancel the mission. But he didn't rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. He was still a Jew later, but he didn't have a choice. And why do I call it an insane love for Esther? Because it wasn't a sincere love for Esther. How could you love somebody if you see that she won't come to you unless she's forced? It says all the time, Vatilokach Esther, because we know, the Medrash tells us that any time Esther was with Achashverosh, when she left Achashverosh, she went to the mikveh and she was with Mordechai. Now I ask you, why do we have to know that? Isn't that personal information? Well, why do we have to know that she went to the mikveh and she was with Mordechai? But it's coming to tell us that Esther never went willingly to Achashverosh. Because if she ever went willingly to Achashverosh, she would have been forbidden to Mordechai. So therefore the fact that the Medrash is telling us that she still lived with Mordechai means that she never went willingly into Achashverosh. Now that's an incredible feat of Mesiras Nefesh. Because we know that Achashverosh burnt at the stake, alive, his former queen for not coming to him. Right? Vashti refused to come to him, and in that case, Vashti at least had an excuse that it was an outrageous request to come in an unsneistic manner in front of millions of people. Here Achashverosh only asks Esther, who was his wife, to come to him. And yet Esther perpetually refuses. Each time that she goes to Achashverosh, he has to call out the royal guard, and they have to point spears to her back and literally push her into his room. Otherwise she wouldn't come. So each time she was Moser Nefesh. This is the heroics of Esther. And yet Achashverosh loved her so much. So obviously this is not a normal love. It's a divinely love that was put into Achashverosh in order to save the Jews. But if it wouldn't have been for this insane love that he had, he would have killed all the Jewish people. And he wasn't embarrassed for this to be recorded. I mean, he let it be recorded that he acceded to Haman's request to totally commit mass murder, to be a Hitler Yamach Shemai, against the entire Jewish population of the entire world. So this gives us a true character picture of Achashverosh. And Achashverosh wasn't even embarrassed to have it written that Esther was afraid to fulfill Mordechai's missive, to come to Achashverosh to beg for her life, to call an SOS, to dial 911 in order to save her life. Achashverosh wasn't embarrassed to have it recorded that his own wife was afraid that she might be put to death. In other words, Achashverosh thought these things were okay. That's the type of person that we're talking about. We're talking about a person who's not ashamed to admit that he at one time was ready to commit mass murder, to commit genocide against an entirely defensive people. He wasn't embarrassed to admit that his own wife was afraid under the threat of her life to come to him. So now we're getting a picture not of a king who was hoodwinked. We're getting a true picture of an Achashverosh who was a totally wicked, ruthless anti-Semite. And the only reason why he didn't wipe out the Jews is because the Rebbeinu Shalom saved us through Esther. And now we're beginning to understand why this Megillah was called Megillas Esther. Because from beginning to end, the revelation of the divine hand is seen through none other than Esther. Mordechai makes a lot of sense. Mordechai was a member of the Sanhedrin. Mordechai spoke 70 languages, and therefore he was able to uncover the plot of Bixum Vaseresh. Mordechai makes a lot of sense. Haman, that he hated the Jews, also makes a lot of sense. He comes from a long ancestry, has a pedigree of Jew haters. He descended from Amalek. But Esther, she totally and constantly defies the imagination. She was picked from all the women in the world as the most beautiful woman. The Gemara tells us Esther, so she had a greenish tint on her face. According to one Medrash, Esther was 75 years old. And we know she wasn't a virgin because she was married already to Mordechai. And yet Achashverosh picked her from over all the women of the world. He didn't want to look at anybody else. And even though she was always refused to come to Achashverosh, and she had to be forced in each time, instead of killing her, he wanted her more. And he was ready to listen to any of her requests. And he killed the most powerful man and his most loyal partner, the one he was in cahoots with, all for her. And he wanted to kill the Jews, and he didn't do it for her. So we see that over here in Esther we see clearly the divine hand. And that is why the Megillah is called Megillah Esther. All right, I thank you for joining me tonight. I'd like to remind you once again to stay tuned next week when I hope we will have a hesped for the Rosh Hashiva. One of the nights I'm planning to say it. It will be announced the night before. Also, I would like to remind everybody that if you would like to receive any tape, you could call me right now at 718-983-7095. That number once again is 718-983-7095. If you would like to arrange to receive a Daf Yomi tape nightly, that can also be arranged at 718-983-7095. Hoping to hear from you tonight. This is Rabbi Moshe Meir Weiss, once again at 718-983-7095. Until Sunday, Be'ezus Hashem Yisrael, this is Rabbi Moshe Meir Weiss in the name of my dear Eish Yisrael Mim Libby, our son Nehemiah, our daughter Chana, and of course myself, wishing you to have a very healthy and happy Shabbos, a very good night, and a very good day.
65 days a year, a Yid must learn Torah. Today was a very sober day for Klal Yisrael, a sad day, and a one of tremendous loss. However, tonight is Purim, and Purim must be a joyous day. Rabbi said, normally on Purim we have difficulty fulfilling one of the commands. In the Megillah it says, Kayomim asher nochu vahem ha-Yehudim. You should celebrate Purim like the days that the Yehudim rested. V'achodesh asher nepach lahem miyogain l'simcha. Like the month which was switched from grief to joy. U'me'evel l'yom tov. And from mourning to festivity. Normally we have problems generating in ourselves a feeling of turnabout, a feeling of switchover from grief to happiness, from mourning to joyousness. Usually on Purim all we feel is solid joy and solid happiness. We usually don't feel that change from Eiva L'Yom Tov. However, this year, indeed, we have to work to switch over from Eiva L'Yom Tov. But that we are charged to do. We are indeed charged now, as Purim begins, to celebrate Purim the correct way, to not minimize from its joy, for its joy is a command, the Divrei Kabbalah from Mordechai and Esther. And indeed, this year, more than any other year, we could really feel the switch Me'eva L'Yom Tov. Me'afela from darkness, like Rav Ruderman said today at the Levaya, the Olam became finster. The Olam became darker. The world became blacker. However, now we have to go Me'afela L'Orgadol. On Purim we have to celebrate a festival of light. And to say over what Rav Nisan Alpert Shlita said by the Levaya, that when Rav Shiftal Shlita, Rosh Hashiva's oldest Aiden, Rav Moshe's oldest son-in-law, passed away, Rav Alpert, who lived a few floors above Rav Moshe, heard the Rosh Hashiva pacing back and forth into the wee hours of the night. However, the next morning, when Rav Alpert looked out his balcony window, he saw at that very day that Rav Moshe was going to be maspid his own son-in-law. He saw Rav Moshe sitting and studying his normal learning schedule. Because the world must continue, we have to do what we are charged to do. And today we are charged to do the mitzvahs of Purim and to rejoice on Purim. So Rabbi said we should not minimize that joy. If anything, this year we'll do it with a greater amount of lishma. We'll do it more l'shem mitzvah and not for our own personal joy. Now, speaking about turnabout and a switchover, this is one of the major themes of the Megillah Esther. The Megillah shows us how there was a complete turnabout in many aspects of the episode. We see first that Achashverosh killed his wife because of his friend. Right? He killed Vashti because of his friend Haman, who was known alias as Memucha. Then he killed his friend because of his wife. He killed Haman because of his wife Esther. a complete vanahafaychu, a complete turnabout. Likewise, we see that Haman had prepared a gallows to hang upon it the lonely Mordechai. And there was a complete turnabout, and Mordechai hung the lonely Haman on that very same gallows. It was to be a total wipeout in the month of Adar of the Jews, Rahman al-Islam. And the opposite happened. In the month of Adar, there was a total wipeout of the Amalekis. Haman chose as the month for his dastardly plot the month of Adar, calculating that Adar was the saddest time for Klal Yisrael because Moshe Rabbeinu died in Adar. And v'nahafeichu, now in our history, Adar has become the most joyous month for Klal Yisrael. Mishanichnas Adar Marvin B'Simcha. And so as we look through the episode of Purim, we see constantly this thread of anahafeichu, a complete and total turnabout, a midah keneged midah. However, what I've just mentioned are obvious insights. I'd like to share with you a new insight that I've noticed this year. We know that when Ahasuerus made his outrageous request to Vashti that she should come in front of all the men of Shushan in a very unsneeristic manner, in a very immodest fashion, Vashti refused. Now, it wasn't a outrageous refusal. It made sense. After all, she was asked to do something that women normally don't do. And we have to understand that Vashti was Ahasuerus' bride. The Medrash tells us that this 180-day feast was nothing else but a wedding. Ahasuerus was marrying his young bride, Vashti. And as fits a monarch of the entire world, he didn't settle for a weekend wedding. He wanted to have a 180-day wedding. It was to be the wedding of the century, a gala event. So what happened over here is a normal situation where a Kala said no to her husband, said no to her husband. Now, isn't it kind of strange that Memucham, who was Haman, suggested such a harsh penalty? A penalty of death? A penalty of burning by the stake? I mean, something must have been propelling Haman to make such a suggestion to Ahasuerus. And you have to know the crafty Haman was walking a tightrope. Because if Haman wouldn't have succeeded in having Vashti burned, then he would have created for himself a mortal enemy. And as soon as Vashti would have wiggled herself back into her husband's favor, Haman would have been doomed. So Haman was treading a very tight line over there. That's why Haman had to make sure that Vashti would never see Ahasuerus again. Because he couldn't take the chance that Ahasuerus might be enamored by her love and pardon her. Then Haman would be up the creek. So therefore Haman made it clear in the decree that she wouldn't be able to see the king again. But what motivated Haman to take such a chance? And what pushed him and propelled him and caused him to suggest such an extreme punishment for Vashti? So the Medrash tackles this problem in three different ways. One explanation of the Medrash is that Vashti and Haman didn't get along. It says once Vashti kicked Haman in the face. So it happened to be a matter of a simple grudge. Haman had a grudge on Vashti. Another explanation of the Medrash, it might sound familiar, is that Haman had a grudge against Vashti because Vashti forgot to invite his wife to the wedding. The invitation was sent out to the Honorable Mr. Haman. Vashti forgot to invite Zeresh. And because Vashti forgot to invite his wife, he was so insulted that he decided, by hook or by crook, he wanted to get her out of the way. However, the third explanation of the Medrash is by far the most popular one. The Medrash says that the reason why Haman was so dead set at having Vashti permanently removed is because, once again, we have an example of the selfish Haman who was interested only in me, myself, and I. Haman wanted that Vashti should be out of the way, because he had a beautiful young daughter, very beautiful young daughter. And he figured, well, if Vashti is out of the way, who would be the best contestant for First Lady? None other than my daughter. Look she has, charisma she has, she's beautiful. And after all, it would make sense that Achashverosh, when looking for a mate, would choose somebody who's second in line. And I'm the prime minister. I'm second in rank, none other except to the king. So therefore, Haman figured that it was almost for sure, he was almost 100% that if Achashverosh would kill Vashti, that he would choose Haman's daughter as the next king, and that would put Haman in a very, very cushy position as the king's shver, as the king's father-in-law. And with a little more intrigue, who knows what he could do. This is what Haman aspired for when he suggested and convinced Achashverosh, his old buddy, to kill his wife Vashti. However, Haman's plan backfired because the king did not take a liking to Haman's daughter, not enough to marry her at least. But this was the motivation for Haman. Okay, now let's turn the pages a little bit and look to a later episode in the Megillah. What do we find later on in the Megillah? We find that when Achashverosh couldn't sleep, after all, Gabriel threw him out of bed 66 times, and that night he couldn't sleep. So they read to him from the Chronicles, and he heard about how Mordechai saved his life and was never rewarded. So Haman was conveniently by the courtyard that morning. So Achashverosh asked him, tell me, in what way do you think we should honor somebody that saved the life of the king? So Haman loaded it on, and then to his shock, and he almost had a attack when he heard, go do it to Mordechai. Well, the king's command is the king's command, and you have to fulfill it. So Haman found himself in the undignified position of acting as a horse driver for Mordechai, as Mordechai sat on the horse in splendid, majestic robes. Now, as they were passing beneath Haman's rich penthouse house, his penthouse apartment, so Haman's beautiful daughter looked out from her big window and saw that, lo and behold, there was a man dressed majestically riding on a horse. Well, she said, he's too skinny to be Achashverosh. Who else could it be? It must be my father. And that man that's leading him in such a degrading position, that must be my father's arch enemy, Mordechai. So she took the child's potty, she took the chamber pot, full of dung, full of manure, she dumped it with accurate aim right on top of the person who she thought was Mordechai. Little did she realize that it was really her father, Haman. Haman got a filthy shock, and when he looked up in shock and anger to see who it was, he saw none other than his beloved daughter. When his daughter saw the face of her father picking himself up and looking upward with his face dripping dung and manure and urine, she had such a shock that she threw herself out of the window and she died. That's what the Medrash tells us happened. But now, Rabbi say, with our additional intelligence, we see what a complete turnabout there was over here. Haman had Vashti killed. Haman committed royal murder in order to pave the way for his daughter to be the next first lady. And Mida Keneged Mida, his daughter was put to death. And don't think his daughter didn't deserve it. After all, she wanted to dump a pot of manure on the Gadol Adar's head. But if we look a little closer, we'll see that there's even more of a divine hand involved over here. Because, let's picture it, Vashti is sitting in the bride's celebration. They had a separate celebration for the bride. And she's having the time of her life, 180-day wedding, and now 7 days special event. And she's in the highest mood of ecstasy. After all, she's marrying the most powerful man in the world, and she's in seventh heaven. Her husband makes an absurd request, which she refuses, and she tells her friends, he's drunk. He'll come out of it in a few minutes, or he'll sleep over and he'll realize that it was only to his detriment to have me come out in that fashion and have all the men see me that way. And she forgot about it. Next thing she knows, the royal troops come in and they say, Vashti, let's go. So she says, where are we going? More surprises? More food? More dance? So they say, no, we're going out to the palace courtyard. She says, what for? She says, we're burning you alive. She says, what? Are you crazy? Is this some kind of a joke? They say, no. You refused to obey the orders of the king. You are married by Malchus, and Achas Dosei Lahamas. There's only one law in this kingdom, and that is death. She pales, but she still thinks, well, let me speak to my husband about it. It must be a joke. They said, sorry, you can't see your husband. She says, what are you talking about? I just got married to him. Of course I want to see his bride. He's not going to have me killed without speaking to me. What are you talking about? He loves me. To no avail, they silenced her, and they let her out, and they burnt her in the stake, at the stake. And we could imagine that she was in a state of shock. Well, Rabbi said, that's exactly Nida Keneged Nida, what happened to Haman's daughter. Haman's daughter died in a state of shock. She looked out the window, and instead of seeing Mordechai, who she gleefully planned to throw manure and dung on, she saw it was her beloved father who she held in the utmost respect. And from that shock, she jumped out of the window and died. So we see how complete the turnabout was, how corresponding one part to the other part is so exact. Now, if we look a little further and dig a little deeper, and really we only touch the surface, but for our efforts, we dig a little deeper, we will see that Mordechai went out, sak v'efer, yutza l'rabim. We hear that in shul tonight. That means he was dressed in sackcloth and he had ashes upon his head. Here again we have the complete turnabout. Haman, after leaving Mordechai, it says he went nitchaf el beisai, he went back to his house, ovel v'chafoi reish. In mourning, dressed in mourning because he lost his favorite daughter. And chafoi reish, and his head was coated with a film of dung and manure. So here we have a complete midah keneged midah, a complete turnabout. Mordechai originally was the one with the sack and the ephod, with the mourning clothes and the ashes upon his head. And then at the end, it was Haman who was Ovel v'chafoi reish. Before we continue, I'd like to remind everybody, if you would like to receive a copy of tonight's tape, you could call me right now at 718-983-7095. That's 718-983-7095. We learn our share tonight, Le'ili Nishmas, Harav Hagain, Moirenu v'Rabbeinu, Reish Kol Klal Yisrael, Moshe ben David, Zatzal, that is Neshama Shirav and Aliyah, and as he himself charged Rabbi Tziratzkin by his Levaya that he should go and bring the Mashiach for us, so we say to the Rosh Hashiva, Moiri v'Rabbi, Moirenu v'Rabbeinu, please bring us the Mashiach. It's a time of Geula now. Adar and Nisan is a season which is so mesugel for Geula. Bring us, O Rebbe, the Mashiach. In Yirtzeh Hashem, after Purim, we're not supposed to be maspid on Purim, but after Purim you can stay tuned, Be'ezus Hashem Yisrael, to Hespedim, which Be'ezus Hashem, I will say, recovered our Rebbe, the Rebbe of all of Klal Yisrael, Moreinu v'Rabbeinu Harav Moshe Zecher Tzadik V'Bracha. Once again, if you would like to receive tonight's tape, that number to call right now or after the share is 718-983-7095. Now, those of you that learned the Megillah might notice a strange thing, and I really first noticed it this year, and that is, we know that when Achashverosh and Haman executed the decree, and it says that the entire Jewish population were in mourning, so Mordechai sent a missive to Esther, hurry up, you have to approach the king and plead for your life and the life of your people. Esther at first said, it's not a good time. Mordechai, wait a bit. The king didn't see me for the past 30 days. And he set a rule that if anybody comes in unbidden, he's going to put them to death. It's not an opportune time for me to go in now. I'm going to go in, and I might not be able to even open my mouth. He might kill me. So why don't you save me until the king calls me, and then I'll be able to do it without risk. And something might give me their bad. So Mordechai said, no, it's urgent. You have to go in now. But one might wonder, why was Esther so worried? I mean, after all, the king was so enamored by her that he chose her above all the maidens of the entire 127 provinces. Now, you have to understand that she was not a basura. And Achashverosh had all the time the pick of the most beautiful women of the entire world. And yet he fell so madly in love with Esther that he didn't even need to view any women further. He said, forget about the rest. I want her. If Achashverosh was so madly in love with her that afterwards, when Esther came, he said, I'll give you half the kingdom. 50-50 we'll split it. I won't even have anything up on you. If Achashverosh was ready to divide his kingdom and to lose his supremacy, then how could Esther even have thought for a moment that Achashverosh would want to kill her if she came unbidden? However, I would like to suggest the following approach. And that is, we know that Esther was married to Mordechai. And being an Eshes Ish, she was not allowed to go to Achashverosh willingly. If she would have went to Achashverosh willingly, she would have become forbidden to her husband. And we know the Medrash says that after she left to Achashverosh, she was again with Mordechai. Because whenever she went to Achashverosh, it was only under compulsion. Vatilokach Esther. It doesn't say Vatikach Esther. It says Vatilokach Esther. She was always forced to go to Achashverosh. When Haggai wanted her to go into Achashverosh, she didn't ask for anything. Because she didn't want to tempt Achashverosh. Everything was under compulsion. She only took what Haggai told her she had to take. Everything was done only under duress. So whenever Achashverosh called for Esther, it was he had to get the troops. He had to get the palace guards. He had to activate the National Guard and say, drag her in here. So Esther said to Mordechai, here I always go in forced. I never comply willingly to his commands. And now when he made a command that nobody should come, if I would just this time go in willingly against his will, he would fly into a rage. He would say, this girl's out of her mind. When I call her, she doesn't want to come. And now when I said nobody should come, now she comes willingly. And that might incite him to do away with me. After all, he did away with his other wife, Vashti, because she didn't listen to his command, she didn't listen to his bidding, and she refused to come when he called her. So now he might do away with me when I come when he refused to see me. And therefore, she suggested to Mordechai to wait. But Mordechai said to Esther, no. Klal Yisrael is in danger. The divine hand is involved over here. It's not normal that you, who are not young anymore, and you're akroitis, you have a green complexion, it's not normal you should have been chosen to be queen. It's obvious that you were chosen for this precise reason, and therefore do not delay. Klal Yisrael is in danger. Act with zrizas and go in now. And indeed Mordechai was right, and Esther was successful. All right, I would like to remind everybody once again that we learned tonight Le'ilui Nishmas Hagoyin HaTzadik Moshe ben David Zecher Tzadik Levracha, and that we will have the Ezras Hashem Yisbarach Hespedim for him. I will say a Hesped Bezras Hashem Yisbarach after Purim and Shushan Purim. You could stay tuned for that. If you would like to receive a tape of tonight's shir, you could call me at area code 718-983-7095. That's area code 718-983-7095. If you would like to hear shiurim on Daf Yomi, and you would like to receive a Daf Yomi tape every night, then that could be arranged. You could call me about that also at 718-983-7095. Until tomorrow night, this is Rabbi Moshe Meir Weiss. In the name of my dear wife, Mib Libby, our son Nehemiah, our daughter Chana, we would like to wish everybody to have a Freilichen Purim. May you fulfill the mitzvahs of Sudas Purim, of Shalach Manas, of Matan Sav Yoinim, and the Megillah reading, Kitikunam, and may you have a very joyous Purim, when may we only know Simchas from now on, Ad Biat Moshiach Tzidkenu, B'Meher V'Yamein. A Freilichen Purim.
A special warm welcome to my recent listeners of this shir. As you might have figured out, this was a shir that was given on the actual night of the day that Hagoyin HaTzadik Rav Moshe Feinstein Zecher Tzadik Levracha was nifter almost a year ago, and his Talmud, Rav Alpert, who I mentioned at the beginning of this tape, also is tragically not with us anymore. So we also learn the Ilui Nishmas Nisan Lipa ben Shapsi, that he should be a Melitz Yosher for us, and his neshama should have an aliyah. As I mentioned on the tape, I had subsequently said some hespedim over our great Rebbe. If you would like to receive those hespedim, you could contact me at 983-7095 or write to me to Rabbi Moshe Meir Weiss, P.O. Box 143, Staten Island, New York 10309. Let us hope that these great tzaddikim, Rav Moshe Zecher Tzadik U'Kodesh L'Bracha, Rav Alpert, should be a Melitz Yosher for us, that we and our families should have a very healthy and sweet Adar, that we should be Zeicha Be'ezus Hashem Yisbarach to the Bias Girl Tzedek B'Mehera. Once again, in the name of my family and myself, I would like to wish you all a very healthy and very merry Purim.